The Antarctic continent has always been a place of extremes, extreme cold, extreme isolation, and extreme mystery. But what transpired at Research Station Vostok-4 in the winter of 1998 remains one of the most perplexing chapters in the history of polar exploration. To understand the gravity of the event, one must first understand the setting. Vostok-4 was not a primary base. It was a remote outpost established to monitor deep ice seismic activity near the subterranean Lake Vostok. The station was designed to be self-sufficient for months at a time, housing a skeleton crew of 6 highly trained scientists and engineers. They were seasoned professionals, accustomed to the psychological strain of the long polar night. The timeline of the incident began innocuously enough. Routine communication logs from the station indicated normal operations up until the 14th of July. The weather reports were standard for the season, temperatures hovering around -70 degrees Celsius, with wind speeds manageable for the reinforced structures. The team, led by Dr. Elena Rostova, a glaciologist of renown, had been conducting deep-core drilling samples, aiming to reach ice layers that had remained untouched for millions of years. Their last transmission, time-stamped at 08 USAR hours on the 14th, was a data packet containing seismic readings. There was no distress signal, no indication of equipment failure, and no mention of personnel illness. The transmission simply ended, and then silence ensued. Initially, the lack of communication was attributed to atmospheric interference, a common occurrence in the region due to magnetic storms. Command at the main base, Meridian Station, waited the standard 24 hours before attempting to re-establish contact. When those attempts failed, anxiety began to mount. The protocol for such situations was clear, yet the severity of the weather prevented an immediate rescue flight. For 3 days, Vostok-4 remained a ghost on the radio waves. It wasn't until the storm broke on the morning of July 17th that a reconnaissance plane could be dispatched. The pilots reported that from the air, the station appeared intact. The generator's exhaust plumes were visible, indicating that power was still running. However, there was no movement on the ground, no vehicles were missing, and the external floodlights were blazing in the perpetual darkness, cutting through the ice fog like beacons. Upon the arrival of the ground rescue team, the scene they encountered was one of eerie stillness rather than chaos. The main airlock was sealed from the inside, requiring an override code to open. This detail is crucial. It suggests that whatever happened, the threat, if there was one, was not perceived as coming from the exterior. Inside, the station was warm. The heating systems were functioning at optimal levels, and the hum of the ventilation was the only sound greeting the rescuers. As they moved through the decontamination chamber and into the main living quarters, the sense of wrongness deepened. The station did not look like a crime scene, nor did it resemble the site of an emergency evacuation. It looked, disturbing as it may sound, completely lived in. In the mess hall, 6 trays of food were set out on the table. The meals were half-eaten. Coffee cups were still sitting near the plates, some with liquid remaining. It appeared as though the crew had been in the middle of a meal when they were interrupted. Yet there were no overturned chairs, no spilled drinks, no signs of a struggle or a sudden rush to the exit. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist in the middle of dinner. The rescuers noted that personal items were still in place. Reading glasses were folded next to a plate. A data pad was left active on the table, displaying a chess game mid-match. The normality of the scene was its most terrifying aspect. If there had been a fire, a gas leak, or a hull breach, the signs would have been immediate and catastrophic. Instead, there was only this frozen tableau of domestic routine. Moving deeper into the station, the rescue team checked the sleeping quarters. All bunks were made, personal lockers were secured, and nothing appeared missing. The medical bay was arguably the most significant area of interest. The logs on the medical computer showed that Dr. Rostova had accessed the system 2 hours after the last official transmission. She had not entered a patient record, but had instead run a query on auditory hallucinations caused by infrasound. This singular digital footprint was the first crack in the facade of normalcy. It suggested that prior to their disappearance, at least one member of the crew was experiencing physiological or psychological anomalies. The search for the crew continued to the technical wing, where the drilling controls were located. The drilling room was situated at the far end of the station, closest to the ice shelf. Here, the machinery was in standby mode. The drill head was retracted, and the samples from the lattice core were neatly labeled and stored in the refrigeration unit. However, the logbook for the drill operations contained a handwritten entry. The ink barely dry. It did not contain technical data. Instead, it was a sequence of numbers, coordinates to be precise. These coordinates did not correspond to any known map of the surface. They pointed to a depth, a location nearly 4 kilometers beneath the ice, directly into the liquid water of Lake Vostok. Beside the logbook lay a voice recorder, a standard piece of equipment for dictating notes when hands were busy with heavy machinery. The team leader pressed play. The tape did not contain Rostova's voice, nor that of any of the scientists. Instead, it captured a sound. It was a low-frequency hum, rhythmic and mechanical, almost like a heartbeat, but metallic. It was faint, barely audible. Over the static, but distinct enough to cause the hairs on the back of the listeners' necks to stand up. The recording lasted for 10 minutes before cutting off abruptly. Following this discovery, the team conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter. It was outside, near the array of seismic sensors, that they found the first physical evidence that contradicted the sealed nature of the station. One of the heavy survival suits was missing from the locker room, yet all 6 crew members were unaccounted for. This mathematical discrepancy was baffling. If only one suit was gone, where were the other 5 individuals? The harsh Antarctic environment would kill an unprotected human in minutes. It was impossible for 5 people to leave the station without gear and survive long enough to get out of visual range, unless they didn't leave. The rescuers returned to the station to conduct a more invasive search, checking maintenance crawl spaces and storage holds. They found nothing. The station was simply empty of human life, yet full of the artifacts of living. As the investigation turned towards the seismic data recorded in the station's server, a pattern emerged. At the exact moment communication was lost on the 14th, the sensors picked up a massive vibration. It wasn't an earthquake. The signature was wrong. It was a singular high-energy pulse originating from directly below the station. This pulse lasted for exactly 12 seconds. The intensity of the vibration should have caused structural damage to the station, shattered windows, or at least knocked items off shelves. Yet, the mess hall remained undisturbed. The half-eaten meals, the upright chess pieces, the liquid in the cups, everything defied the physics of the recorded event. It was as if the station itself had been shielded, or the vibration existed on a plane that did not interact with physical matter in a traditional way. The mystery deepened when the rescue team attempted to access the hard drives containing the core sample analysis. The files were corrupted, not by random data decay, but by a deliberate overwrite. Someone or something had wiped the specific data related to the biological analysis of the ice samples retrieved in the last 48 hours. The command code used to authorize this deletion belonged to the station's engineer, a man known for his meticulous record-keeping. Why would he destroy the very data they were there to collect? And why do it moments before vanishing? As the weather began to turn again, threatening to trap the rescue team at the site, they made a final, chilling discovery. In the observation dome, a small bubble of reinforced glass at the top of the station, used for celestial navigation and weather monitoring, they found a telescope. It was not pointed at the sky. It was angled sharply downward, focused through the glass floor of the dome, looking down at the snow. But it wasn't the snow that drew their attention. Scratched into the interior condensation on the glass of the dome, fading but still legible, was a single sentence. It wasn't written in urgency or panic. The handwriting was steady. It read, "We hear it calling from the water." The team prepared to evacuate, taking the logs, the recorder, and the corrupted drives with them. They sealed the station, leaving it exactly as they found it, a tomb of silence in the white wasteland. As the helicopter lifted off, the pilot looked down one last time at the solitary structure of Vostok-4. The floodlights were still burning, illuminating the snow, and there, at the edge of the light, where the shadows of the ice ridges began, something caught his eye. It was a set of tracks, not boot prints, and not the tracks of a vehicle. They were drag marks, wide and smooth, leading away from the station, but they didn't lead out into the wilderness. They led towards the center of the camp, and then, inexplicably, stopped dead in the middle of the open snow, as if whatever made them had been pulled straight down into the solid ice. The retrieval of the physical evidence from Vostok-4 marked the transition from a rescue mission to a classified investigation. The artifacts, the voice recorder, the hard drives, and the station logs were transported to Meridian Station under heavy security. The isolation of the Antarctic continent meant that the analysis had to be conducted on-site, miles away from the resources of a fully equipped forensic lab. However, the specialists at Meridian were some of the best in their fields, and what they began to uncover in the days following the disappearance shifted the narrative from a tragedy of isolation to a crisis of inexplicable physics. The first breakthrough came from the audio analysis of the voice recorder found near the drill. The rescue team had described a rhythmic metallic hum, but the spectrographic analysis revealed a complexity that the human ear had missed. When the audio track was slowed down and the background static filtered out, the hum dissolved into distinct, repeating pulses. It was not the grinding of gears or the shifting of ice plates. The frequency modulated in a pattern that mathematicians at the base identified as a prime number sequence. This discovery was chilling. Nature creates patterns, spirals, fractals, waves, but it does not broadcast prime numbers in a sequence. The sound was not a byproduct of machinery, it was a transmission. The origin of the sound was triangulated based on the vibration recorded by the microphone's diaphragm. It had originated from the borehole itself, traveling up the 4 kilometers of cable directly from the sub-glacial lake. Simultaneously, the IT specialists were working to reconstruct the corrupted data from the engineer's hard drive. The deletion had been thorough, a secure wipe intended to make the data irretrievable. However, magnetic resonance recovery managed to salvage fragments of the file allocation table and several cache files from the hour preceding the event. The reconstructed data did not show biological organisms, which had been the primary theory. Instead, the glaciologist, Dr. Rostova, had been logging density readings of the water at the point of the drill's breakthrough. The fragments showed that the water pressure at the bottom of the borehole had not stabilized as expected. Instead, it had fluctuated wildly, as if the volume of the lake was expanding and contracting in sync with the audio pulses recorded on the tape. The final entry, recovered in partial text, was a warning. It simply read, "The barrier is permeable. We have breached the containment." Armed with this new and unsettling information, a second expedition was authorized. This was not a rescue team, it was a containment unit. Dubbed Team Echo, the group consisted of structural engineers, military-grade communications officers, and a medical officer specializing in neurobiology. Their objective was to secure the Vostok-4 station, retrieve the physical core samples that the first team had been unable to carry, and, if necessary, seal the borehole permanently with concrete. They arrived at Vostok-4 10 days after the initial discovery. The weather had worsened, burying the drag marks seen by the pilot, leaving the station a pristine white monolith against the grey sky. Upon entering the station, Team Echo found that the conditions had deteriorated significantly. The generators, which had been running during the first visit, had ceased. The interior temperature had dropped to match the outside, freezing the half-eaten meals into solid blocks of ice. The silence was absolute. The station felt heavier. The air pressure inside noticeably lower than the exterior, causing a subtle popping in the ears of the team members. They moved immediately to the drilling wing, the epicenter of the anomaly. The plan was to drop a fiber optic camera and sensor array down the borehole to visually inspect the depth that Dr. Rostova had been so concerned about. As the engineers prepped the cable, the medical officer conducted a sweep of the living quarters, looking for any biological residue that might explain the crew's disappearance. In the personal locker of the missing engineer, hidden behind a false panel, a journal was found. Unlike the official logs, this handwritten diary detailed the psychological decline of the crew. It described how, 3 days before the disappearance, the team had stopped sleeping. They had all begun to share the same dream, a vision of a vast, dark city submerged in water, illuminated by a light that emitted no heat. The journal entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into jagged scribbles. The final entry described an urge to join the frequency, to become part of the signal that was vibrating through the floorboards. This confirmed that the auditory hallucinations Rostova had researched were not hallucinations at all, but a symptom of exposure to the signal. Back in the drilling room, the camera descent began. The winch whirred, feeding kilometers of reinforced cable into the dark throat of the ice. The first 3 kilometers showed nothing but the smooth blue-white walls of the glacier, scarred by the passage of the drill. However, at the 3,600-meter mark, just above the liquid interface of the lake, the visual feed changed. The ice walls were no longer rough. They were perfectly smooth, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the camera's spotlight with blinding intensity. The heat sensors on the probe registered a spike. The temperature in the shaft rose from -40 to nearly freezing in the span of a few meters. Then, the camera breached the waterline. The transition was seamless, the lens slipping from air to liquid. The water of Lake Vostok, isolated for 15 million years, should have been crystal clear. Instead, the feed showed a dense particulate matter suspended in the fluid. It looked like black dust, swirling in a current that shouldn't exist in a stagnant sub-glacial lake. As the camera descended further into the water, the audio sensors on the probe, hydrophones designed to listen to ice cracking, began to scream. The signal was back, but it wasn't a hum anymore. It was a roar, a cacophony of overlapping frequencies that overloaded the audio limiters on the surface deck. The structural engineers watching the monitors saw something that defied explanation. In the murky depth, illuminated by the probe's floodlights, shapes began to coalesce. They were not organic, they were geometric, massive, angular structures suspended in the water, composed of a material that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. It looked like a lattice, a grid of dark matter stretching down into the abyss, and entangled in this grid, approximately 50 meters below the waterline, was an object. The operator zoomed in. It was the missing survival suit. It was suspended in the water, attached to the dark lattice by what looked like translucent cables. The suit was not empty. Through the faceplate, the camera captured a glimpse of a face, pale, preserved, and eyes wide open. It was Dr. Rostova. She was not decomposing. She was in a state of suspended animation. But the most terrifying detail was not her presence, but her orientation. She was not floating aimlessly. Her hands were pressed against the lattice, and her head was turned upward, looking directly at the camera, directly at the team, watching from 4 kilometers. Above, panic ensued in the control room. The mission commander ordered the immediate retraction of the probe. "Pull it up, now!" he shouted, his voice cracking over the comms. The winch engaged, the motor straining against the weight of the cable. But the cable didn't move. The tension gauge spiked into the red. Something was holding the probe. Down in the dark water, the camera feed spun violently. The black dust swirled faster, forming a vortex around the suspended figure of Dr. Rostova, and then the monitors flickered. The face in the suit moved, a slow, deliberate blink. The hydrophone audio shifted again, cutting through the static with terrifying clarity. It was no longer a mechanical pulse. It was a voice, synthesized and distorted, utilizing the raw frequencies of the lake to form words. It spoke through the speakers in the drilling room, vibrating the very bones of the containment team. "Acceptance," it said. "Integration." The cable snapped. The tension release was explosive, the steel wire whipping back up the shaft with the force of a bullet, shattering the winch mechanism and sending debris flying across the room. The monitors went black as the connection to the probe was severed. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the settling of the disturbed dust and the heavy breathing of the terrified team. But the incident was not over. The hole in the ice, now an open wound to the world below, began to exhale. A mist, cold and smelling of ozone and ancient copper, started to rise from the borehole. It wasn't just gas. It was the atmosphere of the lake, breaching the surface for the first time in eons. The medical officer, who had been standing nearest to the shaft, collapsed. He didn't faint. He fell to his knees, his eyes rolling back into his head, his hands clawing at his ears. "I can hear it," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and horror. "It's not just a signal. It's a memory. They are all down there." The commander ordered an immediate evacuation. The mission was scrubbed. They had to leave before the mist filled the station. They scrambled to the snowcats, abandoning the equipment, abandoning the station to the encroaching cold. As they sped away across the ice, putting distance between themselves and Vostok-4, the communications officer looked back. The external floodlights of the station, which had been flickering, suddenly stabilized. They turned. A deep, violet hue, a color that shouldn't have been possible with the halogen bulbs installed. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat that matched the signal from the tape. Back at Mirny, the fallout was immediate. The quarantine protocols were enacted. The members of Team Echo were placed in isolation. Their blood work showing inexplicable anomalies, trace amounts of an unknown isotope that matched the spectral signature of the mist. But the true horror lay in the data that had been transmitted in the final milliseconds before the cable snapped. The probe had sent one last packet of information, a sonar map of the lake's interior. The map didn't show a lake bed. It showed depth, unfathomable depth. The sonar pulses had traveled down for miles without hitting a bottom. Lake Vostok was not a shallow pool of water sitting on rock. It was a doorway, and the city the crew had dreamed of was not a ruin. The sonar map revealed movement, massive, coordinated movement. The lattice structure was not a building, it was a mechanism, and it was rising. The Antarctic Treaty Nations were briefed in a closed session. The decision was unanimous and immediate. Vostok-4 was to be erased. No more rescue missions, no more data retrieval. The risk of contamination or invasion was too high. An airstrike was authorized to collapse the ice shelf above the station, burying the site under millions of tons of snow and sealing the borehole forever. But as the bombers approached the coordinates 2 days later, the pilots reported a visual anomaly. The station was gone. There was no crater, no wreckage, no sign of a struggle. The ice was perfectly flat, smooth and unbroken, as if Vostok-4 had never existed. The coordinates were checked and rechecked. This was the spot, but the station, the borehole and the anomaly had simply vanished, consumed by the ice, or perhaps taken by what lay beneath it. The pilots returned to base, their mission unfulfilled. The file on Vostok-4 was sealed, stamped with the highest level of classification. The world moved on, the mystery relegated to the realm of conspiracy theories and folklore. But deep in the archives of Meridian Station, the recording of the final transmission remains. And sometimes, when the atmospheric conditions are right, the radio operators at the southern edge of the world pick up a signal. It's faint, buried in the static of the aurora australis. But it's there. A prime number sequence broadcasting endlessly into the void, and recently the sequence has changed. It is no longer counting up, it is counting down. The years following the disappearance of Vostok-4 and the subsequent vanishing of the station's physical structure were defined by a suffocating blanket of silence. Officially, the incident was redacted from all public records. The families of the crew were told a fabricated story about a catastrophic gas explosion that vaporized the facility, a lie convenient enough to explain the lack of bodies. However, within the intelligence communities and the upper echelons of global scientific monitoring, the Vostok Event became a subject of obsessive, terrified scrutiny. The countdown detected by the radio operators at Meridian Station had not stopped. It had become a metronome for an approaching deadline that no one understood, ticking away in the background of the world's radio frequencies, audible only to those listening in the deep bands of the spectrum. For 5 years, a clandestine task force known as the Meridian Group operated out of a bunker in the Svalbard archipelago, far removed from the Antarctic site but connected via a dedicated network of satellite uplinks and deep ocean sensors. Their sole purpose was to monitor the anomaly. They observed that the prime number sequence had evolved into a complex logarithmic countdown. Based on the rate of decay in the signal's intervals, mathematicians projected the countdown would reach 0 on October 14, 2003. As the date approached, the physical laws around the South Pole began to exhibit subtle destabilizing shifts. Magnetic north began to drift erratically, wandering miles, off course in a matter of days, forcing the recalibration of GPS satellites to avoid navigational errors in global shipping. 2 weeks prior to the projected 0 hour, the phenomenon ceased to be purely local. Submarine crews in the southern Pacific reported hearing the Vostok hum through their hulls, a vibration so deep it caused nausea and disorientation among sailors. Migratory patterns of whales and seabirds collapsed. Thousands of animals were found beached or wandering inland, their internal compasses shattered by the interference radiating from the pole. The Meridian Group watched the data streams with growing dread. The energy output from the empty coordinates of the former station was rising exponentially, yet there was no heat signature. The energy was cold, a form of entropy that seemed to be consuming the thermal energy of the surrounding environment. On the morning of October 14th, the countdown hit its final integer. The expectation was an explosion, a shockwave, or a sudden emergence of the city seen in the hallucinations of the lost crew. Instead, the moment of 0 was marked by an absolute, deafening silence. The signal cut out. The static that had plagued the Southern Hemisphere's radio bands for years vanished instantly. For 6 minutes, Every sensor monitoring the region went dead, not offline but flatlined, registering absolute zero in sound, movement and electromagnetic activity. It was as if the Antarctic continent had been paused in time. When the sensors came back online, the readings were impossible. The topography of the Vostok region had changed. Satellite imagery, previously obscured by a persistent, unnatural cyclone of cloud cover that had swirled over the site for years, suddenly cleared. The images transmitted to Svalbard showed that the ice shelf where Vostok-4 once stood was gone. It hadn't melted, it had been transmuted. A circular area, exactly 10 kilometers in diameter, had turned jet black. It wasn't water, it was a solid, vitreous substance, smooth as obsidian, sitting perfectly flush with the surrounding white snow. The Meridian Group authorized the immediate deployment of an unmanned rover, the Boreas 9, which had been staged at a remote outpost for this very contingency. The risk to human life was deemed too high, given the fate of the previous teams. The Boreas 9 was a heavy-duty autonomous vehicle equipped with radiation shielding, spectrographs, and a high-tensile drill. It rolled out from its hangar, traversing the frozen wastes under the control of pilots thousands of miles away. The journey to the coordinates took 12 hours. As the rover approached the boundary of the anomaly, the onboard cameras captured the transition. The ragged, wind-sculpted snow simply ended, replaced by the perfect, frictionless surface of the black circle. As the rover's treads moved onto the black material, the telemetry provided a shocking analysis. The surface was ice, but its molecular structure had been altered. The hydrogen bonds had been compressed to a density that rivaled diamond. Embedded within the black ice were millions of microscopic particulates, the same black dust seen in the water years prior, but here, frozen in the surface, they formed a rigid, conductive lattice. The entire 10-kilometer disk was a single, solid semiconductor. The rover proceeded to the center of the circle, the precise location of the original borehole. There was no hole. The surface was unbroken. However, the ground-penetrating radar revealed that the structure beneath was not solid rock. The radar waves punched through the black ice and hit a void. A massive hollow chamber existed just 50 meters below the surface, extending down into the darkness. And floating in the center of this void, preserved in the vacuum, was Vostok-4. The station was intact. It had not been destroyed. It had been pulled down through the ice and suspended in this subterranean cathedral. The external lights of the station were off, but the structure itself was glowing with a faint, bioluminescent pulse. The Boreas 9 zoomed its optical lenses, focusing on the station's windows. They were not covered in frost. They were clear. Inside, movement was visible. Shadows were pacing the corridors. The figures were human-shaped, but their movements were disjointed, looping in repetitive cycles, like a glitched recording. The operators in Svalbard commanded the rover to initiate a drilling sequence, attempting to extract a core sample of the black ice for analysis. The diamond-tipped drill bit lowered, spinning at maximum RPM. The moment it touched the surface, a reaction occurred. The black ice didn't chip or crack. It rippled. The vibration of the drill triggered a resonance throughout the entire 10-kilometer disk. The sound returned, not the mechanical hum of the past, but a pure, tonal note that shattered the rover's audio input sensors. Simultaneously, the bioluminescent glow from the suspended station beneath the ice flared. The light traveled up through the translucent black floor, illuminating the rover from below. The shadows inside the station stopped their pacing. They all turned toward the ceiling, looking up at the machine on the surface. The telemetry data from the rover began to overwrite itself. The binary code was being replaced, line by line, with a complex geometrical language that the Meridian Group's computers could not decipher. It wasn't a virus. It was a handshake protocol. The intelligence below was establishing a connection. Then, the Boreas 9's camera caught a movement in the periphery. The edge of the black disk, where it met the white snow, was expanding. The transmutation was not finished. It was active. The black ice was growing, converting the normal ice at a rate of 1 meter per second. It was eating the glacier. The calculations ran instantly in the bunker. At this rate of expansion, the anomaly would encompass the entire Antarctic continent within 6 months. The rover's connection began to degrade. The final image transmitted showed the surface of the black ice beneath the vehicle becoming liquid again. The Boreas 9 began to sink, not into water, but into the substance itself, which acted like quicksand. As the camera lens was submerged, it didn't go dark. It showed the interior of the black ice. It was filled with light, a vast purple web of energy connecting the millions of dust particles. And in that web, the rover's camera captured one final impossible detail. Drifting in the suspension of the black medium were the missing members of the original rescue team and the flight crew that had vanished years ago. They were not dead. They were part of the lattice. Their nervous systems appeared to be integrated into the glowing web, their eyes wide and glowing with the same violet hue. They were the processors of this massive biological computer. The feed cut to static as the rover was fully consumed. Back in Svalbard, the screens went dark. The room was silent save for the hum of the cooling fans. Then, a printer in the corner of the command center activated. It began to print, unbidden. It didn't print data. It printed a map of the world. On the map, specific locations were marked with the same coordinates that had been found in the Vostok logbook. There were 12 locations in total, one in the Mariana Trench, one in the Siberian tundra, one in the Amazon basin, and one directly beneath the very bunker the Meridian Group was sitting in. The floor of the bunker shuddered. It was a microscopic vibration, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to those who had studied the Vostok profiles. It was the start of the hum. The anomaly wasn't spreading from the pole alone. It was emerging simultaneously from 12 dormant nodes across the globe. The countdown hadn't been for the end of the event. It had been a synchronization timer. The network was now online. As the scientists looked at the trembling coffee cups on their desks, realizing the impossibility of escape, the main screen in the command center flickered back to life. It displayed a live feed from a weather satellite. The cloud cover over the Antarctic had returned, but it was no longer white. The storm spinning over the South Pole was grey and heavy, laden with the metallic dust, and it was moving north, carried by the jet streams, carrying the seed of the black ice into the atmosphere of the inhabited world. The containment had not just failed. It had never existed. The planet was being reformatted. The realization that the Meridian Group's bunker in Svalbard sat directly atop one of the 12 dormant nodes shifted the operational parameters from observation to immediate survival. The vibration that had begun as a microscopic tremor in the floorboards escalated rapidly, not into a violent earthquake, but into a resonant frequency that defied the structural dampeners built into the facility. It was a hum that could be felt in the teeth and the marrow, a physical manifestation of the signal that had originated in Antarctica. The monitors in the command center, flickering under the strain of the electromagnetic distortion, painted a grim picture of the global situation. The Vostok event was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was the ignition point for a planetary synchronization. The 12 coordinates printed by the automated system corresponded to geological pressure points: the Mariana Trench, the Siberian Traps, the Amazon Basin, the Saharan Eye, and others. Within minutes of the synchronization signal from the south, satellite telemetry confirmed that these locations were active. In the Amazon, the dense canopy of the rainforest was not burning, it was calcifying. Aerial reconnaissance showed a wave of transmutation spreading from the center of the jungle node. The organic matter, trees, vines, river water, was being converted into the same black, crystalline lattice found at Vostok. It was a rapid fossilization process, preserving the biological complexity of the forest while stripping it of its organic volatility. The jungle was turning into a vast, silent sculpture of glass and carbon. In the Pacific, the anomaly manifested differently. The node in the Mariana Trench did not create a solid surface. Instead, it altered the viscosity of the ocean. A circular zone of water, roughly 20 kilometers in diameter, became heavier, denser, sinking rapidly, and creating a massive displacement current that threatened the coastlines of the Pacific Rim. Yet, there were no tsunamis. The water wasn't being pushed out. It was being pulled down, cycling into the crust of the Earth to feed the subterranean mechanism that had just awakened. The ocean was acting as a coolant for a machine of planetary scale. Back in Svalbard, the Meridian Group attempted to initiate the Black Box Protocol. This was a contingency designed for the total loss of the facility, ensuring that the accumulated data, the history of the signal, the biological profiles of the Vostok crew, and the analysis of the black ice would be preserved for whatever authority remained on the B. Outside, the primary hardlines were severed by the shifting geology beneath the bunker, forcing the technicians to rely on a localized burst transmission laser array aimed at a geosynchronous relay satellite. It was a desperate attempt to archive the truth before the facility was reformatted by the anomaly. As the upload progress bar crawled across the main screen, the physical environment of the bunker began to succumb to the node's influence. The concrete walls did not crack. They began to sweat. A metallic sheen appeared on the porous surfaces, spreading like mold. It was the same transmutation observed in the ice, but adapted for silicate and steel. The air filtration systems failed, not because of power loss, but because the filters themselves had merged with the ventilation shafts, fusing into a single, solid block of matter. The oxygen levels began to drop, replaced by the faint, ozone-heavy scent of the mist that had risen from Lake Vostok. The psychological effect on the personnel was immediate and profound. As the frequency of the hum intensified, the panic that had initially gripped the room began to dissipate, replaced by a strange, lethargic calm. This was the most insidious aspect of the phenomenon. The signal acted as a neural dampener, inhibiting the fight-or-flight response. Scientists who should have been scrambling for the emergency exits instead found themselves sitting at their stations, watching the walls change color with a detached scientific curiosity. They were documenting their own assimilation. One observer noted in the final log entry that the fear of death was absent, replaced by a sense of inevitability, a feeling that they were being archived rather than destroyed. Outside, the bunker, the grey storm described by the weather satellites, had reached the northern hemisphere. The jet streams carrying the particulate matter from the Antarctic had woven a shroud around the planet. The sky turned a uniform, slate grey, blocking out the sun and plunging the world into a perpetual twilight. This atmospheric dust was highly conductive, effectively creating a global Faraday cage. Radio communications across the continents began to fail. GPS systems went offline. The internet, reliant on satellite uplinks and undersea cables that were now passing through active node zones, fractured into isolated intranets. The world was going dark, not just visually, but digitally. The burst transmission from Svalbard completed just as the power grid in the bunker was absorbed by the lattice. The laser array fired a single compressed packet of data into the orbit of the last functioning relay. This packet, encrypted with the highest level of clearance, was not directed to a government agency or a military command, as those Structures were rapidly disintegrating under the confusion of the blackout. It was directed to an automated deep storage server located in a decommissioned salt mine in the Swiss Alps, a facility designed to survive a nuclear winter. The data arrived, was verified, and the servers in the salt mine locked down, burying the knowledge of the Vostok Event under kilometers of rock, waiting for a future that might be able to understand it. Inside the Svalbard Command Center, the transformation reached its zenith. The floor, now fully converted into the black, vitreous substance, became translucent. Beneath their feet, the scientists could see into the earth. The node was not just a pocket of energy. It was a physical structure, a spire of the dark machinery rising to meet them, and within that spire, mirroring the discovery in Antarctica, were figures. But these were not human. They were older. The ice and rock of the Arctic had preserved the remnants of a previous civilization, or perhaps a previous iteration of life that had been stored in the lattice millions of years ago. The Meridian Group realized, in their final moments of independent thought, that the invasion was a misconception. The system wasn't arriving. It was rebooting. The 12 nodes were hard drives, and the Earth's surface was the screen being wiped clean for the next operating system. The bunker was sealed by the black ice. The entrance tunnel fused shut, erasing the door from the side of the mountain. To an observer on the snowy peaks of Svalbard, the facility simply vanished, leaving behind a smooth, dark scar on the landscape that hummed with a low violet light. The vibrations stopped. The node had fully integrated the location, with the 12 nodes active and the atmospheric shield in place. The next phase of the phenomenon began. The nodes started to connect. Immense subterranean currents of energy began to flow between the Mariana Trench, the Amazon, Siberia, and the poles. These currents generated a new magnetic field, one that was significantly stronger than the Earth's natural magnetosphere. This new field began to interact with the grey atmospheric dust, causing the sky to phosphoresce. The perpetual twilight shifted into a glowing auroral canopy that covered the entire globe. Night and day ceased to exist as distinct cycles. There was only the pale purple luminescence of the shield in the scattered remnants of the outside world, where humanity was trying to make sense of the silence and the changing sky. A new pattern emerged. The wildlife, which had been decimated by the initial frequency shift, began to return. But they were different. Animals observed near the exclusion zones of the nodes showed signs of rapid adaptation. Their eyes reflected the violet light. Their movements were coordinated, moving in swarms and packs with a singular consciousness. They were not aggressive, but they were alien in their behavior. They were ignoring the humans, moving instead toward the node perimeters, as if summoned. The silence of the radio waves was eventually broken, not by a government broadcast, but by the Vostok frequency itself. It hijacked every speaker, every surviving transmission tower, and every piece of audio equipment left on the planet. It didn't speak in words this time. It broadcast a sound, a complex harmonic tone that resonated with the new magnetic field. It was a carrier wave, and encoded within that wave was a schematic. The automated systems in the Swiss Alps, recording the broadcast, deciphered the schematic. It was a blueprint. The 12 nodes were not just hard drives, they were anchors. The lattice growing in the Amazon, the machine in the ocean, the spire in Svalbard. They were the foundation points for a structure that was being built around the planet. The Earth was being cocooned. As the realization of the planetary encasement set in, the monitors in the Swiss vault picked up one final anomaly. A signal was originating from outside the Earth's atmosphere, from deep space, responding to the activation of the 12 nodes. It was a retrieval signal. The cocoon wasn't a shield to protect the Earth. It was a shipping container. The planet, with its biological cargo now stabilized and preserved in the black ice format, was being prepared for transport. The stars beyond the grey veil were no longer visible, but the sensors detected a gravitational shadow approaching the solar system, a mass so large it blocked out the background radiation of the universe, moving on a direct intercept course with the silent, glowing world. The arrival of the gravitational shadow at the edge of the solar system was not marked by a visual spectacle, but by a celestial disturbance of mathematical precision. The automated observatories in the Swiss Alps, now the solitary, unblinking eyes of a dormant humanity, recorded the perturbation of the outer planets. Neptune and Uranus did not merely shift in their orbits, they paused. The gravitational influence of the approaching mass was so immense, yet so focused, that it acted as a dampener on the kinetic energy of the celestial bodies it passed. It was not a rogue planet or a black hole. It was a construct, an object of engineered density, moving with a deliberate vector, ignoring the gravitational pull of the sun. Its trajectory was calculated and absolute. It was coming for Earth. On the surface of the planet, the transformation had entered its terminal phase. The atmospheric cocoon, formed by the convergence of the 12 nodes and the metallic dust, had solidified into a semi-translucent shell. To an observer standing on the ground, the sky was no longer a dome of air, but a ceiling of shifting violet luminescence. The sun was reduced to a pale, diffuse smudge of light, barely brighter than the moon. Under this new firmament, the distinction between organic and inorganic matter began to dissolve completely. The forests of the Amazon, already calcified into crystal, began to hum with the same frequency as the Vostok station. The trees were acting as transmission towers, relaying the signal from the Earth's crust up into the atmospheric shell. The oceans, heavily impacted by the node in the Mariana Trench, had ceased their tidal movements. The water had thickened, taking on the viscosity of a gel. Waves no longer broke against the shores. They froze in mid-swell, sculpted into permanent ridges of dark, dense fluid. This gellification was critical for the structural integrity of the planet. The entity approaching Earth was generating a gravitational wake that would have torn a liquid ocean apart, causing tsunamis that would scour the continents clean. The formatting of the planet, therefore, was a protective measure. The Earth was being reinforced, hardened against the stress of what was about to happen. In the cities, the silence was absolute. The panic that had characterized the early days of the anomaly had evaporated, replaced by the physiological override of the Vostok signal. The human population had not been killed. They had been placed into a state of metabolic suspension. In the streets of Tokyo, New York, and London, people stood still, their feet fusing gently with the pavement, their eyes fixed on the glowing sky. They were not statues in the traditional sense. Thermal imaging from the Swiss drones showed that their internal body temperatures were regulated at a precise low level. Their neural activity had synced with the global network. They were no longer individuals processing distinct thoughts. They were nodes in a massive distributed processor. The collective consciousness was no longer a metaphysical concept, but a functioning operating system. As the shadow crossed the orbit of Mars, the 12 nodes on Earth flared in unison. The pillars of black ice that had risen from the Vostok site, the Siberian traps, and the other locations extended upward, piercing the atmospheric shell. They were docking clamps. The sheer scale of the engineering became apparent. The Earth was not merely being harvested, it was being physically coupled to the arrival. The shipping container analogy derived by the Meridian Group was proving to be an understatement. The Earth was a component, a battery or a memory core, waiting to be slotted into a larger machine. The interaction began at 03 hours relative to the old timekeeping systems. The sky above the atmosphere went entirely black, blotting out the diffuse sunlight. The approaching object had arrived. It didn't land. It enveloped. The sensors in the Alps registered a sudden, massive increase in external pressure, not from air, but from a magnetic containment field, wrapping around the planet. The violet shell of the Earth flared bright white as it made contact with the hull of the visitor. For the first time, the shape of the entity could be inferred from the telemetry. It was a helix, a spiraling cylindrical structure of impossible length, wrapping itself around the globe like a serpent, constricting its prey. But there was no violence in the motion. It was a precise, mechanical interlocking. The pillars of black ice connected with the interior surface of the helix, and the connection was sealed. A rush of data transfer began, dwarfing the previous signals. This was not a download. It was an upload. The collective memories, the genetic codes, the geological history of the Earth were being siphoned off the planet and into the helix. Deep within the salt mines of the Alps, the black box servers began to overheat. The upload was so powerful that it was inducing currents in disconnected circuits. The screens in the empty command center scrolled through petabytes of data in seconds. The system attempted to pass the incoming stream from the helix. It wasn't just taking, it was giving instructions. The code was rewriting the fundamental constants of the planet's localized physics. Gravity was being adjusted, time dilation was being initiated, the Earth was being prepared for travel. Then the final physical change occurred. The black ice that had started in Antarctica and spread to the nodes began to cover the oceans and the remaining landmasses. It moved like a fast-forwarded glacier, coating the skyscrapers, the mountains, and the suspended populations in a smooth, protective layer of the diamond-hard lattice. The Earth was being sealed in amber. Inside this shell, everything was perfectly preserved, frozen in a single moment of existence. The history of the human race, its cities, its art, its biology, was now etched into the structure of the planet itself, a fossil record waiting to be read by the architects of the helix. The vibration that had plagued the world for years suddenly stopped. The hum ceased. The silence that followed was different from the quiet of the suspension. It was the silence of a vacuum. The atmosphere had been vented or compressed into the shell. The Earth was no longer a biological world. It was a sealed artifact. The Swiss sensors, running on their final reserves of geothermal power, detected a shift in the planet's vector. The Earth jerked, a single massive acceleration that would have pulverized anything not encased in the lattice. The helix had engaged its drive. It was not just visiting, it was taking the planet with it. The Earth began to move out of its orbital plane, breaking the gravitational tether of the Sun. It was being pulled away from the warmth of the star that had birthed it, dragged into the cold dark of the outer system. As the planet receded from its original orbit, the automated cameras in the Alps, looking out through a portal of the transparent black ice, captured a final image of the solar system. The Sun was shrinking, becoming just another star in the distance. The other planets continued their clockwork dance, indifferent to the abduction of their sibling. But in the void where Earth had been, something remained. The helix had left a marker. It was a cloud of the remaining metallic dust, swirling in the empty space of the Earth's former orbit. As the dust settled, it didn't dissipate, it coalesced. It began to form a shape, utilizing the residual energy left behind by the node activation. It was a seed, a small, dense sphere of the black lattice, no larger than a city, spinning in the vacuum. It was a copy, a backup, or perhaps a replanting. The Earth, now a passenger in the grip of the cosmic machine, accelerated toward the edge of the heliosphere. The upload was complete. The assimilation was total, but deep within the network, inside the frozen, dreaming minds of the suspended population, a new signal began to propagate. It didn't come from the Helix. It didn't come from the nodes. It came from the water of Lake Vostok, which was now the core of the planetary drive. The calling that the original crew had heard hadn't been a warning. It had been a recognition. The entities in the lattice weren't just passengers, they were the pilots. And as the Earth crossed the threshold into interstellar space, they woke up.